Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through 20, New Living Translation. As Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of his disciples said, "Teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones on the walls." Jesus replied, "Yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple. Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked him, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will show us that these things are about to be fulfilled?" Jesus replied, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah. They will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in many parts of the world, as well as famines. But this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. When these things begin to happen, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. You will stand trial before governors and kings because you are my followers. But this will be your opportunity to tell them about me, for the good news must first be preached to all nations. But when you are arrested and stand trial, don't worry in advance about what to say. Just say what God tells you at that time, for it is not you who will be speaking, but the Holy Spirit. A brother will betray his brother to death, a father will betray his own child, and children will rebel against their parents and cause them to be killed. And everyone will hate you because you are my followers, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. The day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing where he should not be. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person out on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that and pray that your flight will not be in winter, for there will be greater anguish in those days than at any time since God created the world, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless the Lord shortens that time of calamity, not a single person will survive, but for the sake of his chosen ones, he has shortened those days. Leaving the temple, Jesus was heading to the Mount of Olives. Look at these magnificent buildings. The sight of the temple would have been awe-inspiring. It was the largest complex. It was the largest temple complex in the world, with immense stones. One stone that had been uncovered in the western wall is estimated to weigh 600 tons. With its white stones, gold trim, and the gold-covered roof, the temple complex looked like a snow-covered mountain. In the sun, it was a blinding sight. Josephus war. The Talmud the Talmud says that he who has not seen the temple in its full construction has never seen a glorious building in his life. Jesus' reply to the disciples was shocking. This glorious and massive temple complex, a symbol of strength and performance and God's favor for the Jews, would be totally irrevocably destroyed. Not one stone will be left on top of another. Jesus' prediction emphasized the total devastation that would result from the Roman army's systematic attack on the entire temple complex. Josephus Antiquities. To say that Jesus' prediction was not fulfilled because some of the foundation stones still stand is to misunderstand the language of prophecy. One does not expect a prophet to say that 97.9% of these stones will be removed. Anyone in the first century who visited Jerusalem after AD 70 would have acknowledged that Jesus' prediction had been fulfilled. Andrew appeared here with the trio Peter, James, and John, completing the two sets of brothers. Jesus' prediction elicited two questions from the disciples. Although some scholars argue that the second question goes beyond the first, in looking to the coming of the Son of Man at the end of the age, it is best to interpret these two questions as focusing on the time and the sign associated with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. These questions follow naturally from Jesus' prediction. The desire to know the sign reflected the disciples' desire to be forewarned and prepared for all these things. This section is often divided into two parts. The first part is often interpreted as describing the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in AD 70, while the second part is taken to describe the coming of the Son of Man in the future. It is best, however, to interpret all of as describing events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 because 1. Jesus' answer to the two questions that deal with the destruction of Jerusalem, the commands to flee Judea, the woe announced upon pregnant and nursing women, and the prayer that it not take place in winter, makes sense if they refer to the events of AD 70, but not if they refer to the future return of Christ. Three warnings in this passage tie this passage together and indicates that should be understood as a unit. The subdivisions of this section are arranged as a chiasm X pattern. Deceivers claim to be the Messiah. There are reports of fighting and natural disasters. There's persecution of being the fighting in Judea and resulting deceivers claim. Jesus warned his followers not to be misled by the many false messiahs who would come claiming, "I am the Messiah," and would deceive many into following them. These false claimants would profess to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, not Jesus per se, or to speak on the Messiah's behalf. Such claimants included Theudas the Galilean, Simon the son of Gioras, and John of Gischala, who deceived many in the AD 60s. The Greek word translated "must" is also used in 831. In both instances, God's sovereignty over events is emphasized, but the end won't follow immediately. These things would occur, and just as birth pains are followed by childbirth, God's judgment on Jerusalem would follow. However, These events did not indicate that it was going to happen right away. The second, watch out, warns of persecution that was to come upon Christians. Jewish Christians Jewish Christians would be brought before local councils of Jewish leaders who had authority over Jewish communities. We read of such a council in Matthew 10:17. And probably in Matthew 5:22, see also Acts, beaten in the synagogues. Paul's beatings in 2 Corinthians were probably inflicted in the local synagogue. The followers of Jesus would also be susceptible to trial before governors and kings. Such trials were due to their being followers of Jesus, not on account of real wrongdoing. Such trials would be a means through which the good news would be preached to all nations. This would all take place first, i.e., before the destruction of Jerusalem. For Paul's understanding of how the good news had already been preached to every nation in his day. A word of encouragement follows the warning of 13:9. Jesus' followers need not fear what they should say in these circumstances. The early followers of Jesus were generally uneducated and without political influence. So this assurance would have comforted them. Believers are not prohibited from thinking about what they will say, but they need not worry about it. There would be no single group, not even their own families, to whom persecuted Christians could automatically flee or turn for help. They would be universally hated because of their allegiance to Jesus. Because you are my followers. Those who remain faithful to death, to the end, will be saved from eternal punishment. Jesus now gave the sign requested in and instructed his followers how to respond when they saw it. In 13, they were told not to be alarmed, but they were told that Jesus and Judea must flee to the hills. The day is coming when you will see the sacrilegious object that causes desecration. Mark did not explain what this object would be, but Jewish readers in the first century were familiar with the term. The prophet Daniel had foretold that such an object would stand in the temple in Jerusalem. And many Jews understood the events in Jerusalem in 167 through 164 BC. During the time of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. To be a fulfillment of that prophecy, the Deuterocanonical book of 1 Maccabees, written about 100 BC, narrates Antiochus's reign and describes how Antiochus and his followers erected a sacrilegious object causing desecration on top of the altar for burnt offerings, standing where he should not be. In light of the historical background and the reference to Jerusalem and Judea, this clause clearly refers to something inappropriate happening in the temple in Jerusalem. Reader, pay attention. Mark alerted his original readers to pay attention to his description of this sign, which indicates that the expression required careful thought and discernment. Mark's readers were to look for a sign that was similar to what had happened in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. Although the phrase "sacrilegious object that causes desecration" is grammatically neuter, the word standing is grammatically masculine, so it refers to a person and not a thing. Suggestions as to who it might have been include 1. The Emperor Caligula, who in AD 39-40 attempted to erect a statue of himself in the temple. Josephus in Antiquities. Pontius Pilate, AD 26-36, who attempted to have the Roman soldiers march into Judea, displaying their standards which were considered idolatrous by Jews. Josephus War. 3. The Zealots in AD 69-70. When they committed atrocities in the temple, appointed an unqualified person as the high priest of the nation, and came into the sanctuary with polluted feet. Josephus War. 4. The Roman general Titus, who after conquering Jerusalem in AD 70 forced entry into the temple as well. Josephus' War. Titus's soldiers who set up their standards in the temple sacrificed to them and proclaimed Titus as emperor. Josephus' War. The destruction of the temple itself in AD 70 or 7, a future event involving the coming of the Antichrist. See 2 Thessalonians. The context and source of the expression eliminates several of these theories. In Daniel and 1 Maccabees, the expression involves the temple, its altar, and its sacrificial rituals. In 13, it is a sign for people to flee Judea, and what it refers to must occur while there is still time to flee, i.e., before the Roman army had occupied Judea and besieged Jerusalem. Explanations 1 and 2 are too early to serve as a recognizable sign to flee Judea. They didn't actually defile the temple, and the Christians did not flee Jerusalem. Explanations 4 through 6 occurred too late, for there would have been no opportunity to flee after Titus entered Jerusalem. Explanation 7 does not refer to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which is the subject of 13, and the coming of the Antichrist would not be limited to Judea. Explanation 3, however, fits well. It occurred in AD 69 through 70, shortly before Titus besieged Jerusalem, which would have given Christians a brief opportunity to leave Jerusalem before it was besieged, and it involved actions that defiled the holy place in the temple. This interpretation also helps to distinguish the sign of the coming disaster, the sacrilegious person, from the disaster itself, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Then, at the appearance of the sacrilege, those in Judea were to flee to the hills. The early church historian Eusebius tells of a prophetic oracle given to the Jerusalem church that caused them to flee the city before its destruction. Eusebius, Church History. A person relaxing on the roof of his Judean home should not even pack after seeing this sign, but to come down and flee. Likewise, a person out in the field should not return home to retrieve his coat. Believers were to flee from the approaching Roman army as soon as they saw the sign of 13. The Roman army did not practice a swift blitzkrieg kind of war. Their movement tended to be cautious, methodical, and relentless. Jesus warned against playing a waiting game to see how things would develop. The intensity of the coming disaster is illustrated by the suffering of the most vulnerable. In that day, the joy of motherhood would be accompanied by terrible trouble. In winter, the wadis, the canyon-like riverbeds, are flooded, travel is more difficult, and survival is harder. Greater anguish in those days than at any time since God created the world. This hyperbole is common in Semitic expression. It heightens the terror of that horrible time and should not be taken as an exact statistical analysis of how this suffering ranks alongside other disasters. And it will never be so great again. The events of 13 would not bring history to an end. History would continue after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. God's shortening of his timetable for the days of calamity is referred to frequently in intertestamental Jewish literature. This statement emphasizes the horrors of this tribulation experienced by God's people, but also God's mercy in shortening this time. Not a single person will survive. The whole population of Judea might have been destroyed if the days of anguish had been longer. Chosen ones, literally elect followers of Christ. Precious. Mother. No? Want to take your medicine, sweetie? Yeah, honey. You were really coughing last night. See, I noticed that it doesn't help to give you that thing twice a day, sweetie. You have to give it to you. Really, no. No. I'm just gonna give it to you. About 15 years before Jesus was born, 20 BC, Herod the Great began to remodel and rebuild the temple, which had stood for nearly 500 years since the days of Ezra. Herod made the temple one of the most beautiful buildings in Jerusalem, not to honor God, but to appease the Jews whom he ruled. The magnificent building project was not completely finished until AD 64. Jesus' prophecy that not one stone would be left on another was fulfilled in AD 70 when the Romans completely destroyed the temple and the entire city of Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives rises above Jerusalem to the east. From its slopes, a person can look down into the city and see the temple. Zechariah predicts that the Messiah will stand on this very mountain when he returns to set up his eternal kingdom. Disciples wanted to know when the temple would be destroyed. Jesus gave them a prophetic picture of that time, including events leading up to it. He also talked about future events connected with his return to earth to judge all people. Jesus predicted both near and distant events without putting them in chronological order. Some of the disciples lived to see the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. This event would assure them that everything else Jesus predicted would also happen. Jesus warned his followers about the future so that they could learn how to live in the present. Many predictions Jesus made in this passage have not yet been fulfilled. He did not make them so that we would guess when they might be fulfilled, but to help us to be spiritually alert and prepared at all times as we wait for his return. What are the signs of the end times? There have been people in every generation since Christ's resurrection claiming to know exactly when Jesus would return. No one has been right yet, however, because Christ will return on God's timetable, not ours. Jesus predicted that before his return, many believers would be misled by false teachers claiming to have revelations from God. According to Scripture, one clear sign of Christ's return will be his unmistakable appearance in the clouds, which will be seen by all people. Revelation, in other words, you do not have to wonder whether a certain person is the Messiah or whether these are the end times. When Jesus returns, you will know beyond a doubt, because it will be evident to all true believers. Beware of groups who claim special knowledge of Christ's return, because no one knows when that time will be. Be cautious about saying, "This is it," but behold in your total commitment to have your heart and life ready for Christ's return. As the early church began to grow, most of the disciples experienced the kind of persecution Jesus was talking about. Since the time of Christ, Christians have been persecuted in their own lands and on foreign mission fields. Though you may be safe from persecution now, your vision of God's kingdom must not be limited by what happens only to you. A glance at the newspaper will reveal that many Christians in other parts of the world daily face hardships and persecutions. Persecutions are an opportunity for Christians to witness for Christ to those opposed to him. God's desire is that the good news be proclaimed to everyone in spite of persecution. To believe in Jesus and endure to the end will take perseverance, because our faith will be challenged and opposed. Severe trials will sift true Christians from fair weather believers. Enduring to the end does not earn salvation for us, but marks us as already saved. The assurance of our salvation will keep us strong in times of persecution. The sacrilegious object that causes desecration refers to the desecration of the temple by God's enemies. This happened repeatedly in Israel's history. In 597 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar looted the temple and took Judean captives to Babylon. In 168 BC, when Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig to Zeus on the sacred temple altar. When the zealots committed atrocities in the temple, appointed an unqualified person as high priest, and polluted the sanctuary. Just a few years after, Jesus gave this warning in AD 39 through 40. The Emperor Caligula made plans to put his own statue in the temple, but he died before this could be carried out. The chosen ones are God's chosen people, those who are saved. See Romans 8:29-30 and Ephesians 1:4-5 for more on God's choice.